Do you like dramas? I'm more of an action-adventure or sci-fi person myself, but I have a lot of friends that love a good drama. You know, something that tugs at your emotions, makes you think, makes you cry. The next event in Mark's Gospel is a drama. If you put yourself into the scene, it will tug at your heartstrings and keep you riveted from start to finish. We pick up in Mark chapter 5, verse 21. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. So Jesus and his disciples have returned to Jewish territory once again, and again the crowds are clamoring around him. Jairus is the ruler in the local synagogue. This makes him a very important and influential man in his community. He is not one of the religious leaders. You may remember from our look at Mark chapter 1 that synagogues did not have permanent rabbis leading them. The synagogue ruler was usually a lay person who handled the day-to-day of synagogue activity. He would oversee the worship services, the care of the scrolls, running the weekly school, distributing the alms, and taking care of the building in general. By this time, the Pharisees were opposed to Jesus and were questioning and attacking him at every turn. Jairus, as a synagogue leader, would be expected to follow their example, but he did not care. He was desperate. He did not care what the religious leaders thought. He didn't care what the people would think of him throwing himself at Jesus' feet. His daughter was near death. Now, Jesus had traveled up and down the cities by the Sea of Galilee, and doubtless Jairus had heard and probably even seen Jesus perform many miracles. And so he falls at Jesus' feet, begging him to come and lay his hands on his daughter. He believes that this will save his daughter and she will live. His desperation and faith are shown by his leaving his daughter's side precisely at her last moments. Jesus is his last hope. And so Jesus agrees to go with him, and they start toward Jairus' house. The crowd, not wanting to miss another show, thronged about him, further slowing their progress. We read in verse 25, "And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse." This woman is also desperate. Jairus' daughter was 12 years old. This woman had been suffering from her issue for as long as the girl had been alive. She had not only been suffering from her disease, but also from the cures. She had spent all her money, and the doctors had done nothing to help her. One commentator writes, "The Talmud itself gives no fewer than 11 cures for such a trouble. Some of them are tonics and astringents, but some of them are sheer superstitions, like carrying the ashes of an ostrich egg in a linen rag in summer, or a cotton rag in winter, or carrying a barley corn which had been found in the dung of a white she-ass. No doubt this poor woman had tried even these desperate remedies." This condition of hers would also make her unclean by Jewish law, and thus she was an outcast in society. She would not be allowed in the synagogue or the temple, and she would be shunned almost as much as a leper in her community. Jesus was her last hope. Verse 27. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. This action shows her faith. She believes in Jesus' power to heal, but it's a superstitious faith, believing that merely touching the tassels of his robe is enough, almost like magic. It is also a selfish faith. She wanted to be healed, but she did not want to seek the healer. She wanted to touch and run, you might say. And so she sneaks through the crowd of people to touch his garment in hopes that no one will notice her actions, not even Jesus. And it worked. This reminds us of an important truth. It does not take great faith in order for Jesus to show his power. Though this woman had a weak, somewhat incomplete faith, it was enough for her to receive healing. Jesus said that faith the size of a mustard seed can move mountains. We all need the attitude of another desperate father we will meet in Mark chapter 9, who responded to Jesus by saying, "I believe, help my unbelief." Verse 30, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garment?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. Though the woman tried to conceal it, Jesus knew what had happened. He had not given the command or touched the woman intentionally, but he knew that someone had been healed. The disciples' point is logical, but it shows that they still do not understand who their master really is. And despite the crush of the crowd and the disciples' objections, Jesus had to confront this woman's incomplete faith. She needs more than healing. She needs a relationship. She had been healed physically. Now he wanted to heal her spiritually as well. Verse 33, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Why was this woman so hesitant to come forward? Perhaps she feared punishment for her actions. Her condition made her unclean, and to touch someone else would make them unclean. But having been found out, she has no choice but to come and fall at Jesus' feet in fear and trembling and tell him the whole truth. But instead of being reprimanded for her actions, as she probably expected, Jesus speaks compassionately to her, calling her daughter. This woman had tried to hide in shame, but Jesus calls her out in public, not to shame her, but to restore her. Restore her to himself and to the community that has shunned her. In his commentary, Mark for You, Jason Meyer writes, "Faith brings more than the gift of healing. It brings the gift of identity. Jesus called the paralyzed man son, and now he calls this woman his daughter. Salvation says more than you are not guilty, you can go free. It says you are family, you can stay. Ever since the first sin, people have tried to hide from God in their shame. But God will graciously call them out and not let them hide. God draws us out not to expose us, but to clothe us and call us as his own. And so Jesus calls the woman out, and then he corrects her wrong notion. It was not some magic touching of his clothes that healed her. It was her faith in him. Imperfect as it was, that had made her whole. He then calms her fears by telling her to go in peace. Her long struggle was over, and her disease had been permanently healed. Jesus did what no one else could do. As I imagine this scene, I can see Jairus impatiently standing there. His daughter was dying. This was an emergency, and Jesus stood here talking to this woman whose condition was not life-threatening. They were wasting precious minutes. And then, what this father had most feared happens. Verse 35, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" Can't you feel Jairus' heart breaking? It was too late. His little girl was gone. If only the crowds hadn't slowed them down. If only Jesus hadn't stopped to deal with this woman. If only. 36, but overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." I wonder how this encouragement sounded to this grieving father. His fears had been realized. What was he supposed to believe in now? His servants were right. There was nothing Jesus could do now. Or was there? Perhaps the miracle he had just witnessed strengthened his faith just enough to continue with Jesus to his home. Jesus' statement to him could be translated, "Stop being fearful. Keep on believing." Jairus had started off well, believing that Jesus could heal his daughter. But the news of her death had shattered his world. Jesus encourages him not to lose faith now. We must stop fearing and trust Jesus. If Jesus is present, we have no need to fear. No matter what the circumstances, we can trust that He is in control. One commentary says, "When you feel hopeless and afraid, when others claim that nothing can be done, remember that Jesus is the source of all hope and promise. You may have to disregard the unbelief of others and hold firmly to Jesus." Verse 37, "And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly." Jesus did not want this to be another spectacle to entertain the crowds. He did not want them to believe in him simply because of his miracles. He also knew that Jairus' family did not need a bunch of people invading their lives right now. And so, leaving the other 9 apostles, possibly to keep the crowds away, he took only Peter, James, and John, his inner circle, and follows Jairus to his home. The scene they encounter is one of great grief and mourning. Since Jairus was a prominent member of the community, many would have come out to support his family during this time of loss. It was also traditional to hire professional mourners when a loved one died, and their mournful flutes and wails would have added to the commotion. Verse 39, "And when he had entered, he said to them, 'Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping.' And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was." What did Jesus mean by saying the child is not dead, but sleeping? Did he think she was merely in a coma? Or did he believe she was not really dead? Obviously not. But Jesus knew what he was about to do. Sleeping was a common euphemism for death. But in Jesus' eyes, she was merely sleeping, waiting for his touch to wake her up. As Michael Card says in his book on the Gospel of Mark, "It is not a euphemism, it is a redefinition. In him, death has become merely a sleep from which we will someday be awakened by the sound of his voice. To the crowd of mourners, Jesus' words sounded like nonsense. They suddenly turned from weeping to ridicule. This is a laugh of unbelief. Who did this Jesus think he was? They all knew the girl was dead. Who was he to give this family false hope? Jesus threw this faithless crowd out of the house. Only her parents and Jesus' 3 disciples were allowed to enter the room where the girl lay. Verse 41, taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. Can you hear the tenderness in Jesus' voice? In fact, this scene so impressed Peter, who is Mark's eyewitness, that decades later he remembers the exact Aramaic words Jesus had said. Aramaic was the everyday language of Israel at the time. Mark translates these words for his Gentile readers. But Jesus said Talitha, which means little girl, or even little lamb. It was a term of affection, one that a parent would call their child. And then he said, Talitha cumi. Cumi is not a word commonly used for resurrection. It simply means to arise or to get up. Together, this statement, Talitha cumi, would be something the girl would have heard every morning, as if her parents were saying, and now Jesus is saying, honey, it's time to get up. Verse 42, and immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. I imagine the girl opening her eyes, and the first thing she sees is the face of Jesus. Next, I picture her smiling, jumping out of bed, and running to her mother and father. That they were overcome with amazement is surely an understatement. But Jesus now gives 2 commands. First, he orders everyone to silence. He had given this command in many cases, but this miracle would have really inflamed the passion of the crowds to see Jesus' mission as something it was not. And so this command was for the benefit of his ministry, but it was also for the benefit of this girl and her family. They did not need the invasion of the curious crowds into their lives. Jesus' second command was to give the girl some food. The joy and wonder of raising her from the dead may have distracted mom and dad from the basics. Their daughter had been sick and probably not eating for some time. She needed to be fed to give her strength. And the desire to eat was also a sign that she was completely well. Jesus had done what no one else could do. This event gives us several lessons to learn. One, we learn about the power of Jesus. The last 4 miracles recorded by Mark demonstrates Jesus' power and point to his deity. He has shown his power over nature by stilling the storm. He has shown his power over demons by casting out the legion. He has shown his power over disease by healing the woman with the discharge of blood. And he has shown his power over death itself by raising Jairus' daughter. Together, these prove that Jesus is who he claims to be, the Son of God. No mere mortal could do all the things Jesus did. And if Jesus is who he said he is, then should we not bow at his feet in worship? Second lesson is about the care of Jesus. Notice the stark contrast between Jairus' daughter and the woman with the blood disease. The girl is a privileged 12-year-old daughter of a synagogue ruler. The woman was an outcast who has suffered with a hemorrhage for 12 years. The daughter has enjoyed the love of her family. The woman had been forced to live alone as her disease made her and anyone who contacted her to be unclean. Jairus' daughter had everything. The woman had spent everything in a futile attempt to be cured. And yet Jesus did not show preference for one over the other. They were both precious in his sight and both needed his touch. The crowds may have thought Jairus was more important and ignored the woman's need. But Jesus' love and care has nothing to do with position or power. He met each person's need and treated both with concern and compassion. What an awesome reminder for how we should engage with the world around us. The third lesson has to do with faith in Jesus. Both Jairus and the woman came to Jesus in desperation, as the last resort. Sadly, this is true of many people today as well. They seek Jesus when they have come to their wits' end, when they have tried everything else. They finally turn to Jesus. But as this story shows us, even if that is our approach to Jesus, he will not turn true faith away, even if it is out of desperation. But how much better to put our faith in Jesus first. And then we will know he is with us when the desperate times come. We see the secret of faith in these stories. It boils down to two things: trusting Jesus and telling him everything. Genuine faith requires action. While their faith was not strong, both of these individuals brought their needs to the right person. They had faith that Jesus could do what no one else could do. Finally, in his song "At His Feet" from the album Mark, the beginning of the gospel, singer-songwriter Michael Card reminds us that the demon-possessed man, Jairus, and the woman with the hemorrhage of blood all came and fell at Jesus' feet. The chorus of his song on these miracles is very powerful.
Life and healing in him meet. The dark demonic must retreat. All they'd hoped for and more, they found at his feet.
Once again, in his commentary, Mark for You, Jason Meyer writes, "The people that run to Jesus in the Gospel of Mark are not the smug, self-righteous scribes and Pharisees, or the hard-hearted crowds that listen to his teaching but then go away. They are those who know they are broken, so they cannot deny that they need a healer. They are those who go from bad to worse. They are those who know shame, fear, and guilt, but find grace, freedom, peace, love, power, and mercy when they meet Jesus. They fall before his feet, and he fiercely and tenderly comes to the rescue, breaks the chains, calms the fears, and gives new life and identity." Will you fall at Jesus' feet? And will you stay there to experience the love and power of his presence for every moment of your life?
Talitha Kumi, he spoke like a song. Though lifeless and cold at once, I became strong. Talitha Kumi, he spoke with a smile as he handed my fall